Today I'm going to talk about how logic can help evaluate an analogical argument. An analogical argument is a type of comparison, but it's not a mere comparison, such as Susan is taller than Bill. In an analogical argument, two things are being compared and claim to have certain relevant similarities. And because of their relevant similarities, an additional premise is involved claiming that the first thing has an additional characteristic, and that's why the second thing has that additional characteristic, a structured argument. And every analogical argument has the same structure. You just have to fill in the details. Okay, so let's take that mere comparison, Susan is taller than Bill, and turn that into an analogical argument. Here it is. Susan is going to be the base, A, and Sally is going to be B, the subject of the conclusion. When you're trying to figure out what's A and what's B, what's the base and what's the subject of the conclusion, you must look to the conclusion to see which of the two items is the subject of the conclusion. Otherwise, you just have two things being compared to one another. It's not clear which is the base. Okay, so here's the structure of an analogical argument. Susan and Sally, A and B, have certain relevant similarities. The category to which they both belong, let's call that little a. They're both college students dating Bill. Second relevant similarity, let's call that little b. They're both taller than Bill. Second major premise, Susan, who is the base, won't wear high heels when she goes out with Bill. The conclusion is that B, Sally, won't wear high heels when they go out. Z is true of B, is the conclusion. Z is true of A, is the second premise. So logic provides several criteria by which you can critically evaluate an analogical argument, especially if you put it into the structure, whether or not you know anything about the subject. For example, you might compare the U.S. military occupation of Iraq, A, to the U.S. military occupation of Afghanistan, B, and claim they're both military occupations of a Mideastern country by American military, and claim that Z, since Iraqi occupation was a big mistake, so is the military occupation of Afghanistan. However, here's the problem with analogical arguments. You won't be able to persuade anyone that believes they're not the same because of their understanding of the relevant dissimilarities between the two. So an analogical argument will probably not persuade anyone who doesn't feel that it's a good analogy. Okay, so let's go to the criteria by which logic can help you evaluate an analogical argument. Number one, it's called logical link. Are the words in Z, the additional characteristic provided in the conclusion and the second major premise, is Z in the same ballpark as the relevant similarities? In other words, are there some words in the conclusion that are similar to the words used in the relevant similarities? If not, if there's no similarity between Z and the relevant similarities, the argument is illogical. For example, if Z in the argument I'm discussing is that Susan's grandma is from the Ukraine, well, that's not logically related, and therefore Sally's grandma is from Ukraine. It's not logically related to any of the relevant similarities. Okay, but in our argument, the conclusion Z won't wear high heels, that implies shoes with greater height than flat shoes. That's in the same ballpark as the word taller in the relevant similarities. Next question, how many items are in the base? If it's just one, That's a flaw in any analogical argument. Compare that with the problem of a sample being too small for an empirical generalization to be considered valid. And there is an implied generalization in this argument, and that is all women who date Bill and are taller won't wear heels on a date. But you only have one person, Susan, in the argument, a very small sample. The next question, criteria number 3, is how diverse is the base? Some logic books call this criterion strengthening differences among the items in the base. Well, obviously, if there's only one item or type of item in the base, it doesn't have strengthening differences among all the items in the base. So here I will ask you to add at least 2 items to the base that would provide such diversity. For example, we've talked about what a representative sample would be on the question, who's going to win the next presidential election in the United States? And a sample that only includes middle-aged, highly educated, white women that are Catholic, well-paid professionals is not adequate for a sample to predict the next winner of the U.S. Presidential election. So let's add some hypothetical people to our base. Let's say the following addition will provide diversity on the grounds that Susan is a theology major and she works part-time at the bakery. Okay, if we add Sarah, who is an art major and a part-time model, Stephanie, a single mother who's a biology major, and Samantha, who is an athlete and a phys ed major, they will provide some diversity in the base, especially since Sarah, being the part-time model, might wear the shoe collection she's established from her modeling job that's sitting in her closet. Okay, the next criterion is relevant dissimilarities. And I've indicated earlier that the more important and the more of the relevant dissimilarities are obvious in an analogical argument, the worse the argument is, the weaker the analogy is. So in our case, if they're comparing Susan, who is a theology major, with someone that is very strong-willed person that wears a lot of fashion shoes, she might prefer the shoes she's accumulated in her buying sprees. Okay, so some type of important differences between Susan and, for example, Sarah, the part-time model art major. The last criterion is the criterion of margin of error. And I want to state that it may not have the same meaning that you are accustomed to using in your science or math classes. In logic, margin of error is the likelihood of a statement to be proven wrong. How much room or margin a statement has before it's proven wrong. So that's a function of, among other things, its preciseness, small margin of error, versus its vagueness, and whether it includes mathematical qualities. Compare these two statements for the issue of which is the easier one to prove wrong. Kids eat a lot of sugar. 90% of American kids between 8 and 12 eat more than 20 tablespoons of sugar a day. If it could be shown that 89% of American kids between 8 and 12 eat more than 20 tablespoons a day, that will falsify the second statement, but not the first. So if you want to argue that there's a large margin of error in Z, you could either claim it's because the words are vague in Z, in which case you would provide at least 2 definitions of any of the vague terms, or it lacks numbers, and then you would state the possible measurements or numbers that could have been used. In our example, 3-inch heels instead of high heels. The third aspect of margin of error is if the conclusion goes beyond the scope of the premises. So, for example, if my argument says Aquinas' basketball team has beat Calvin's in the last 3 games, and the conclusion is they'll beat Calvin in the next game, compare that argument with an argument that claims Aquinas' basketball team beat Calvin in the last 3 games, and the conclusion would be Heron, Curry, and Champlin will provide the 10-point spread, not just they'll win the next game. So your critical reasoning here would be show how the premises don't provide the support for the conclusion due to its scope being less specific than the conclusion. Let's look at one more analogical argument. Let's compare Traverse City and Grand Rapids with regard to the issue whether they have a thriving daytime central business district. My base, Traverse City, subject to the conclusion, Grand Rapids, have certain relevant similarities. Category, which is little a, cities in Michigan, other qualities deemed to be relevant similarities. They both haven't done poorly in terms of the financial impact of the Great Recession of 2008. Second major premise, Traverse City has a thriving daytime central business district. Conclusion, Grand Rapids has a thriving daytime central business district. Let's look at the logical link. In Z, we have the words thriving central business district, and in the premises, we also have the word financially, haven't done poorly from a financial perspective. Second question, how many things in the base? Only one, Traverse City. And so the base doesn't have the third criterion, diversity, because it's only got one city. Let's add Holland, Ann Arbor, and South Haven. They provide diversity because Holland is on Lake Michigan and has a college with a lot of students nearby the central business district. Ann Arbor, although not on Lake Michigan, has a large number of college students, and the campus is integrated into the downtown location. And finally, South Haven. It's on Lake Michigan, gets a lot of tourists, and it has, as far as I know, a thriving orchard business. So we provided some strengthening differences in the base. Now, when you think about Grand Rapids and the difference between those two cities, it's not located on Lake Michigan, and it doesn't have a huge college campus integrated into the thriving business district. We have a community college there, but community colleges are typically commuter colleges, and that would claim that that would imply that they're not using the downtown business district for their financial purchases. Okay, finally, the margin of error in my argument. Z was claimed to has a thriving daytime central business district. Well, you can put a dollar amount on that. What a thriving central business district would look like financially. The amount of revenue coming from restaurants, bars, and retail stores. That could have been quantified. So in conclusion, I would claim that in order to make the best logical analogy, it would be one that would have a link between your conclusion and the premises. It would have a diverse base. The differences between the base and the subject of the conclusion wouldn't include a number of really important dissimilarities. And finally, that the conclusion, this may seem counterintuitive, has a large margin of error, and that would entail that it would be difficult to falsify. Of course, there's a problem with a conclusion that's extremely vague in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of predictive power, but it's still logically grounded in the idea of how hard is it to prove false.